Welcome to Margin for Mission, the CRI Cape and Krause podcast, where two friends, Ken and Chris, bring you real talk about creating space for what matters most. Because when your organization has financial and operational margin, you can focus on your mission with confidence.
We're professionals who've spent years helping churches, higher education institutions, and other mission-focused nonprofit organizations manage their accounting, tax, compliance, and other challenges. We understand the complexities you face, and we're here to make it simpler.
In each episode, we'll dive into practical insights on leadership, operations, and the everyday challenges of running a nonprofit without the jargon.
And we'll talk about life, too. Family, faith, quite a bit of football, and finding balance in a world that rarely slows down.
So whether you're managing budgets, leading teams, or just trying to keep your mission moving forward, you're in the right place.
This is Margin for Mission. Let's get started.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Margin for Mission. I know our fellow friend Chris is not here with me today. He's actually out of the country, and it's one of those things that we just enjoy the fact that people get to travel, and that for him, he gets to spend some time with family. I still have the excitement that I get to have some wonderful conversations, and one more importantly is the fellow colleague here, Dan Reiland. So Dan Reiland, I'm so glad you're on this podcast. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Ken, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Well, for those that don't know Dan as well, so Dan has a wealth of knowledge over the years of experience that he's had serving both in ministries and even now from a coaching perspective on leadership development. And I want Dan to be able to share a little bit of a story, but this is where part of it and the tenets of what we're going to be talking about today, it ends up coming into a very critical part for a lot of our leaders, which is leadership development. You know, Dan, I think about some of these quotes from some of the books I've read before from I know some of these notable authors, and I know you probably have heard some of these ones too, that, John Maxwell has said before that, everything rises and falls on leadership. I know Carrie Nieuwhof has also talked about that the church will never be healthier than its leadership. And so those are some of the things for us that we realize it really does play a role on a day-to-day side for a lot of folks from a kingdom building perspective. But this is where part of it is, Dan, I know you have that experience. You've seen this day in, day out from your own story. And I think that's where the best part is to even just start out on your story. So Dan, do you mind sharing a little bit about your story and spend as much time as you want? Because I know you have a wonderful history as well through it.
Well, I'll make the story brief because I love the topic, even better than the story. And my wife will tell you if I start actually telling stories, we'll be here all day. So,
Hey, I'm okay with that as long as I
but,
think we have
just the
unlimited
quick
time on here.
sketch and we could tell stories along the way. But the quick sketch, I was actually born and raised I'm a SoCal boy, born and raised in Southern California, in San Diego. So I
Yeah.
grew up in the beach and palm trees and all that good stuff. And actually, I was headed, my undergraduate degree, very few people know this, was in criminal justice administration. And I was a private investigator for a season.
Oh, wow.
But God got a hold of me and said, that's not my plan for your life, and kind of scooped me up and dropped me into the local church, which was like, that's a long story and how that actually happened. But I went to Asbury Seminary in Kentucky.
Yeah.
And they had a really interesting program there that if you were one of the preacher boys that was tapped by Pastor Butcher and called to ministry, that you were invited back to be an intern at Skyline Church there in San Diego.
Oh, wonderful.
And so it just so happened the year I was graduating seminary was the year Pastor Butcher left. And so we all wondered what was going to happen. And it was actually John Maxwell showed up there.
Oh, wow.
And so my claim to fame, and it's a story for another day, but my claim to fame was I was apparently so bad, I broke John Maxwell's intern program because I was his first and last. He closed it down after that. But the redemption to the story was he invited me on staff after that, and we spent the next 20 years together, and we're still really good friends today. But so there was a season where we moved to Enjoy, remember cassette tapes?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Did that and traveled to churches. And then I love the church. I'm a pastor by heart. And God called me back to one church and 12 Stone, then Crossroads, 12 Stone Church, where I served for 24 more years, again as an exec pastor, and had the time of my life. And we just went through a 3-year succession, a triple succession, another fun story. And now I'm full-time practicing coaching pastors and consulting. There you go. 2 minutes or less, right?
I love that, and I love to dig even deeper on that, and, especially just as you start hearing how the Lord even called you further east, a lot of times it's just one of those things where all this happens not out of, just coincidence, but God has a plan. But one of the things I was curious about this, Dan, was especially because you have that passion for leadership development, what first sparked that passion for leadership development for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's several layers and levels to it, but just so if I could summarize, um, my parents divorced when I was 8 years old.
Mm.
Never saw my dad again after 10, but 10 years old. But I consider myself one of the most blessed, fortunate guys on the planet because out of God's kindness, He sent a series of 5 men to me, this skinny, long-haired SoCal boy, and a kid of the '60s, and they just sought me out and poured in, and for decades, I mean decades, including up to John Maxwell, who was again more decades. And so
Sure.
I think Ken, so much was poured into me, and I saw what happened that it's almost like I don't have a choice. Why would I keep that for myself?
Sure.
My life was so changed that I feel mm, like a kingdom responsibility to give it back.
I love
So
it.
that's kind of the short story.
No, I love it too. And this is where you can tell that it all started even before we had these professions, right? This professional journey. And it's even the personal side. I even think about it as a dad right now to 4 boys, Dan, that from a leadership development, it all starts even at the very beginning, just kind of planting them certain things of working under pressure, dealing with tough situations, how to overcome it, how to be resilient. And then ultimately knowing that I won't be the only person to help coach them from a leadership side. It takes a village. Like you just mentioned, there were 5 other folks that poured into you. At
Yep.
each stage, they're ultimately, I'm sure you've probably seen it. There comes a time where you may look to another person as a mentor. You may see certain things like that play a role into how you also develop. And I know that's part of the parts of leadership development that I've at least seen is so integral. And it sounds like you said, it doesn't even start at your career, but actually it starts even before then too.
Yeah, it does. And I remember, praying over my son every night. We would have this little ritual because I think a lot of leadership development begins with we see something in somebody else.
Yep.
And we see that oftentimes before they do. And so there's a belief that's part of empowerment, the fifth part of empowerment, but we can talk about that later a little bit. But um, we see something in them before they see it in themselves, or we see more in them than they see. And I remember praying over my son, every night we'd tuck him in, tuck him, put him in bed, talk to him,
Yeah.
tuck him in, all that kind of thing. And I would always say, son, you have potential.
Mm.
You have potential. And then I realized one day, I don't know how old he was then. It was a long, long, long time ago. But I wondered, does he even know what the word potential? He's probably about 3 years old. And I was wondering, does he even know what that word is? And so I asked him, I said, son, do you know what potential means? And he goes, no. And he goes, but I think it's something really good.
Yeah.
And kids know. They just know. And of course, we began to unpack it and stuff, and we would play a game afterwards. And I would tell him I would skip saying, son, you have potential. And he would say, Dad, you forgot something. I said, you're stalling, go to sleep. He said, Dad, what? I said, what did I forget? He said, well, I have something. Well, what is it? He goes, potential. I mean, it was just, now that's a little silly game that I'll have to admit to you. By the time he was a teenager, he was done
Yeah.
with the game.
Yeah.
But that young man, that kid knew there was something in him.
Yeah.
And I think that's the gift we get to give to people.
I love it. And this is where part of it is just even the story, I know of course a lot of folks that are listening to this, they know John Maxwell, they know Enjoy and the fact that that has a leadership development piece. But I think even just the experiences you've had both there and elsewhere, like 12 Stone, really have shaped a lot of things that you've seen from a leadership development side. And for those that don't know 12 Stone is a large multi-campus church. And I always say, Dan, I know I always say Atlanta, but a lot of folks realize, Atlanta could be a very big place, just like
Yeah.
for you and I where we live. but for a lot of folks, 12 Stone is a wonderful church. It's been a huge impact in the community, especially in that Northeast Atlanta side. And Dan was very pivotal in that. But this is where part of it I'm curious, Dan, is, during your years at 12 Stone, what did that teach you about building leaders, especially at the scale of the growth that 12 Stone had too?
Yeah, it's a love-hate relationship with that question because I think the thing I learned most um, there for more than 2 decades is it's a s- it's all about it's a slow process and it's a consistent process. You simply can't rush it. It's a compounding thing, and so we're so used to every 7 days and bigger and better and reach more people for Jesus,
Yeah.
and all and we'll talk with churches about leadership development and they get so excited. So the first thing they want to do is have a conference and everybody come and we'll make them all leaders. And it just doesn't work that way. So it's a slow, deliberate, boring process. Now for me it's exciting, but you know what I mean? It's a
Yeah.
deliberate process and it's consistency. There's two key words, simplicity and consistency.
Mm,
And because if you don't keep it simple, the demands of ministry will choke it out and you'll quit.
sure.
If you don't keep it consistent, you're not going to get the results you want and you'll quit. And because the demand ministries will choke out the non-demand ministries, and leadership development's not a demand ministry. So slow and consistent. And then the compounding results are mind-blowing. But it's not a every 7 days, how many can you get? How fast can you go? That's not it.
Now, I was curious in that case, Dan, you talk about simplicity, and this is where part of it is I think there's that level of being intentional. A lot of times, even when I just started out in my career, even in that younger years and all, there was the term about being intentional about finding mentors, right? And mentorship in itself. I was curious about that, how that played a role too for you from a mentorship side and leadership development, both at 12 Stone and other areas that really helped form some of the things that you've seen into saying this is the healthy way of fostering healthy leadership development.
So are you saying that like my mentors or me mentoring others? What's
A
the
mix of both. I think the answer is yes. Is like curious, like especially when it came to what you did in terms of mentorship, but then also in terms of you finding mentors, but then also how you also in return became a mentor to others. It's finding out how important and crucial that is.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sometimes God asks us to do things and we don't even know what we're doing.
Sure.
And so long before 12 Stone, I'm under John Maxwell, and
Hmm.
he's the most
Oh yeah.
amazing, incredible people on the planet. I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm on a flight to uh, Glen Erie in Colorado for back in the day, long before roundtables ever even were called roundtables. And we called them, the cool name back then was a non-agenda forum. But it was basically the forerunner of a roundtable.
Yeah.
And we were gathered there, and God spoke to me very specifically. And he said, John is, I was just flying and thinking, and he said, Pastor John is developing the current leaders, but I want you to develop the next generation.
Mm,
And I don't even know what that means, but he spoke Moses, he spoke Joshua, all those kind of things. And that gave birth, that was 1986. It gave birth to in 1987 to Joshua's men, a 1 year leadership development process that, again, it was very simple, but
yeah.
sometimes God will touch the, remember, let's keep it simple, keep it
Keep
consistent,
it simple. Yeah.
touch things that are simple. It's a very small, simple groups, 1 year long, a book a month. You're filmed preaching, you have prayer partners. I mean, it was just this sort of amazing thing that I had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
Started with 7 guys, and it's continued on. John, and when we finished up there, John said, "Why don't you put that in a cassette? The tapes, the
Yeah.
cassettes." And it's in thousands of churches. Tens and tens of thousands of guys have gone through it. At 12 Stone alone, 1,000 guys have gone through it.
Wow.
It's a leadership intensive thing. So, how is it defined? How is it defined me? I don't even know if I'm answering the question, but I think God has his hand on it. And I think God will honor really simple things,
Hmm.
like that little thing I put together. Now it's a program that churches use.
Yeah.
I think he blesses that. To turn that to a practical thing, and how does it all work? I think there's lots of sophisticated choices now. You can do groups models, you can do a pipeline model, you can do all these things, but the thing I keep wanting to bring it back to is keep it simple. I think leadership development's a lot like prayer.
Mhm.
It's hard to do it wrong, but there's ways to do it better.
Yep.
And if you'll just start practicing, you'll see the ways to do it better. And there's all kinds of really practical things we could get into. Well, how do you do that, and how does that work? But I don't know if I'm answering your question. Am I answering
No,
your question?
no, I love it. No, and this is where part of it is, you started talking about, I was talking about mentorship, but then just even more so on that mentorship, it sounds like being intentional of even just starting of finding a place where you can continue to grow. Because I think a lot of times I've thought about this, even just myself, is when you get complacent and you say, hey, I think everything's fine here. That could be a place for concern. I say complacency is a concern. And it's because of the fact that, like this, if we're not continuing to challenge ourselves, we could easily reach a point here. We just say, I say the word status quo, and that's not actually a healthy place for church leaders, because life changes, environments change. And as leaders, how do you adapt to that? And where can you find fellow folks to help not just keep you accountable, but to help encourage you? Because this is where part of it is, as you can tell, we're in changing times still. And that's where you're having the folks that have seen things similarly before, but then also encourage you, saying, hey, with the uncertainty in the future, this is some of the things that I want to help encourage you so that you don't feel afraid and you stop and everything. And that's why I was just curious about the mentorship side, because even for myself, I have been just blessed that I have had some wonderful mentors over my career, of folks that have seen similar situations and can provide some advice of what they have been through. And then also encouragements about, for your journey, this is what you should do, right? And that's where part of it is, even planting those little seeds, I think have played a big role. And I know you mentioned something about what defined you, as a part of this. I was curious about that, Dan, especially over the course of your career. Was there a defining season or challenge that shaped how you think about leadership and even leadership development today?
I think there was a second one, and I mentioned my son
Yeah,
already, but I don't know how I missed it. But I always thought of leadership development in terms of the church and leaders, and
sure.
I understood because of the mentoring, the importance of leadership. But I think it was still in my head. It was a head thing. But the moment Patty and I were married 8 years before we started our family,
Yep.
and the kids were growing up, and I think I just accidentally was fortunate enough to tell my son he had potential. But I think where it was a defining moment is where I saw leadership's relevance beyond the organization of the church or the corporate world or whatever. But I'm a church guy,
Yeah.
and I saw it in my home. I saw it in we all know, we've all heard the sermons on being a spiritual leader in your home,
Mhm.
and we get that. But there's something about, no, we can actually lead our children, and we can provide spiritual leadership in our home. I don't know, that was a long, long, long time
Yeah.
ago for me, but something clicked there. I just saw it different. And I think what it did is that in my head, it provided a mental model of
Yeah.
leadership development. And it was like the heart of a parent. You've got to care like that. Because it's messy. They come undone.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work. But when you want, the saying, you want more for them than from them. But when you start leadership development, not by an organization, a pipeline or a group, you gotta have all that. But when it starts in the heart and you really care, that
Yeah.
does something. It changes the environment. It changes everything.
It no longer becomes just a rudimentary thing just to practice. It actually is, you're pouring into them. I think that word intentional is so key in this case. And that's where, you start thinking about from a parent side. My goal has been to be so intentional about helping our boys navigate right and wrong, and helping correct in a way that helps them remember in the future, of saying, look, these are some of the things you're going to navigate and have to interact with. one day you'll know what's right and wrong, but how you
Yep.
face it is going to be important because of course there's consequences, right? There's still the same case in leadership development, even in leaders, right? It's one of those things where they are navigating things and they may understand what's right and wrong, but they still need that guidance. And that's where I think this is why this topic is so important for us for this episode about leadership development is because it is critical in church, in ministry, and nonprofits. I'm curious for you, Dan, why do you think as well that leadership development is critical in from a local church content?
Well, I think this I've a lot of passion about. My wife
Yeah.
would laugh at that. She says, "You have passion about everything with leadership development." But I think if any church has a vision that's big enough and bold enough, if you have a vision big enough and bold enough that you can't do it without God and
Mm,
can't do it by yourself, then you have to have more and better leaders. And I think that's a fundamental principle. Leadership's throughout the scriptures, but it's not about us. It's about the church. And
absolutely.
it's a kingdom minded. It's an eternal concept. And so, really, what it is, if the vision is big enough and bold enough,
Yeah.
leadership development is essential.
And this is where I think a lot of times, and this is where just from a church perspective, I think about you mentioned there that leadership is important. It's so critical as a part of even just from a day-to-day perspective. Dan, you've seen it, of course. You were at 12 Stone as a large, growing, healthy, thriving church. You probably have seen what happens to churches that don't intentionally develop leaders, right? And have you seen that? What are some anecdotes that you might be able to share in that case of some of the times you've seen a church that may look okay from the front, but actually because they hadn't intentionally developed leaders, they ended up encountering certain difficulties in the future. Are there some
Yeah.
things like that you could share?
Oh, for sure. I think ultimately, can they eventually hit a lid and they get stuck.
Mm,
But on the road to hitting a lid and getting stuck, these are the things that actually cause church splits and the
yeah,
things that are cause boardroom nightmares. And I could tell you stories that I won't because I love the church and we don't need more stories, but board meetings that were secret and recorded and just
sure.
crazy stuff. You say, but but that's the enemy. Well, I don't know if the enemy started it. I think the enemy loves it, but it's a lack of leadership.
Mhm.
When someone's not pointing the way, who's a trusted leader, someone's going to take over, and then there's competing agendas. There's a lack of alignment. Trust begins to erode. Relationships break down. What you just take that little scenario I just, lack of alignment, trust breaks down, relationships erode. You've got serious trouble. And do I believe all that's because of leadership? Yep, I do.
And with that, do you and a lot of times when you start thinking about that, that doesn't happen overnight where suddenly all that's happening. And I'm curious, are there certain red flags that you've seen as a part of that with churches saying, "Oh, this could easily be an indicator that can get you down a path that ultimately becomes like that?"
Yeah, I think when we don't pay attention to the culture, when
Mhm.
there's unhealthy culture, it's not defined, it's not clarified, when there's lack of alignment, when there's more competition rather than collaboration, I think when expectations aren't unclear. Kevin put something in the water years ago, a very brilliant concept called MVS, mutual voluntary submission. I think without submitting ourselves under God to each other, and you
Mhm.
get the hierarchy, and this is what I want, and this is what I want, and people aren't bad. What happens is they're just under pressure, and so under pressure, we don't always behave the way we should.
Sure.
And we call it pacing pressure because the larger the organization, the faster it goes and the more pressure there is. And sometimes if you're not in a healthy environment with healthy rhythms and healthy practices and honest conversations, then the pace and pressure can get the best of even the best.
Yeah.
And so I think it's those kinds of things to pay attention to. Are there healthy rhythms? What's the culture like? Are there honest conversations? Are you submitting to each other under the sake of the vision? And of course, we all have opinions and ideas. We want people with opinions and ideas. We want people
Of
with
course.
conviction, but it's got to all work. Otherwise, it just turns into competition.
And that's where part of it is realizing, I think was it that John Maxwell had said before that leadership itself develops daily, not in a day, right? And it's one of those things where, you have to kind of talk about the fact that if you let it, put it on the side and not think about it, it could easily navigate and evolve into its own thing. And that's where part of it is you have to be so intentional of saying, look, this isn't just once a year kind of thing. We're not just doing a once a year leadership retreat just to talk about this and move on. This is a daily thing that we have to think about. Leadership development is daily. And so I'm curious about this. I know we've talked about some of the pitfalls, why it's so critical. Would love to hear some of the thoughts if you have, but what are some of the core tenets of a healthy leadership development process for a ministry, for a church, or even nonprofits just in general?
Yeah. If I think it has to start with character. I think you and
Sure.
I agree on that. And I
Absolutely.
think I think one of the reminders is that while we shouldn't be afraid of the word leadership. I remember when it was introduced in the 80s and there was this big, you can't bring business into and the church went nuts for a while. And then, we always go to extremes. But if we simply remember, it's spiritual leadership.
Mm,
And, we can learn from even the Old Testament, good kings, bad kings, you don't have to look far to see there's good leaders and bad leaders. And so we don't have to study hard to know the difference between the two. But I think ultimately, spiritual leadership has to reflect God. It has
absolutely.
to reflect your biblical values. It has to reflect um, what the Holy Spirit is teaching us. And I don't see those as separate at all.
Mm,
I think they integrate naturally. I think they sort of beg to be integrated. I don't think they're separate. I don't think they're separate components. For example, too, I think it's really good for churches to decide what they think about leadership. For example, there's two different groups from years and years ago. One will say that leadership's influence,
mm,
and everybody has influence. Now, some people use it more than others. They develop it more than others. They use it more wisely than others. But just like a mom and dad, everybody has influence. And there's another school of thought that was very different. It was no, leadership's a spiritual gift. Romans 12, you either have it or you don't, period. Well, obviously, you know my bias. And so just even knowing how you think actually changes discipleship in this way. Because if you have, depending on, are you more leadership is influence, everyone has influence, or leadership's a spiritual gift, you have it or you don't, that determines how you philosophically see discipleship. So there's two choices there as well.
yeah.
Some will believe that some of the bias would be that from a new Christian to leadership, it's on one line. You're a born new Christian, you're growing, you're getting more mature Christian, you're developing, and ultimately you can develop into a leader. And others would put leadership and development on a separate line, you know. And so my bias, of course, is that it's one continuum from a new Christian to the potential of leading, depending on how much you wish to serve or how much you'll activate the gifts and talents God has given you. Obviously, there are leaders who have more gifts and talents, but everyone has influence. So it's you've got to think all that underneath first and decide, and that helps you kind of establish your leadership philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think it has to reflect God.
And when you start talking about how to reflect God, that with character is so important because I think about from a leader side, some of the main how at least strengths I've seen for leaders are some of these things I've thought about, which is you mentioned spiritual maturity, right? That the reflecting God. I think humility is such an important thing too, as well, because we've seen leaders that may not show that level of humility, right? And we've seen how people have that perspective of them, but then most of all, integrity. I think, especially, for me, I look up to my dad. He just retired and everything like that, but he used to do leadership development, and he talked about the core tenet of integrity is it is difficult and very long to build, but so easy to lose.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where integrity is such a foundational piece because that in itself also reflects God. And that's where for us as a character, as a leader, we have to be mindful that even though no one may be looking right now, you are still reflecting God in everything you do, the decisions you make, the way you treat people, the way you approach things. And that's where part of that leadership continues to develop because it's not overnight that you learn all that. It's that time of your journey too. No. Well, what about even just thinking about, you mentioned that whole it's a timeline in general, right? Where, I think about the term that leaders don't arrive, they grow, right? And you start thinking about that means that you have to have what I think about is capacity, because a lot of times we live in a world of busy, don't we, Dan? I think even just when I've thought about it, there's a lot of times when I'm sure if I were to reach out to you before, it's like, hey, how are you doing, Dan? I don't think you're going to say, oh, nothing's going on. You'd probably say, well, it's been pretty busy, right? And that means that for a lot of us, we've had as a society the consideration of always saying if we're not busy, that in itself could be a sign that you're just not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But this is where part of his leadership development may also need some level of capacity, breathing room to be able to grow. What are your thoughts on that piece too? That's saying maybe capacity must be developed as a leader.
Yeah, and there's two parts of capacity at least. One is the the literal, there's competence and
Yeah.
capacity. Competence is what are your skills now? Capacity is can you expand those skills, scale them, grow them, It's like little league in the bigs,
Oh yeah.
You may have all the skills, you know how to hit and bat and I mean catch and you have all the skills, but at what level can you do it? That's
Mm.
capacity. But then there's the counterintuitive part of capacity that says you've got to do less to do it deeper. You've got to have rhythm in your life. You've got to have margin in your life. You've got to have breathing space in your life. And some things we may chat about later, I don't know. But even healthy pressure relief practices.
Yeah.
How is it that you learn how to do those? Pace and pressure, we mentioned that. But I think there's a whole other thing, and that is that the capacity, it's internal. We've been talking about internal, but there's also external
Mm.
because here's the truth of the matter. Life's not going to wait for anybody.
Sure.
I mean, that's a blunt statement, but it's life moves forward, culture changes, technology complicates, and we have to continue to grow. We have to continue to keep moving forward. Um, I've been around since the Jurassic era, and I still have to keep growing. I still have to keep learning. I keep stretching myself. And here's what's interesting. One of my favorite ways to keep growing, just one of them, but is I have to now learn from really young generations. Um, I I'm a student of young. I love hanging around them. I love just where do you guys like to go to eat? What do you watch on TV? Where do you listen to on music? They tell me restaurants I've never heard of. They tell me about TV programs. I go, where is that? And I mean, I feel so clueless, but then they they open up a they open up a perspective of life and how they see culture currently that I don't have. And I may bring a little wisdom to the table, but they see culture relevant. They see it like it actually is happening by a younger view. You say, well, why
Hmm.
does that matter? Because they're going to be the next leaders.
Yeah.
And so we have to really pour into each other, listen to each other, but I learn from them. And it's really so much fun. I actually think this is maybe a little bit different, but can I think sometimes I'll get asked, what's the greatest challenge for our
Yeah.
young leaders coming? As we're coaching and developing, 12 Stone has a residency and we have 30 full-time residents actually going towards 60, if
Oh
you
wow.
believe it. And so we're always pouring into very young leaders. And I think one of the most challenging, most important things for a young leader now is to learn how to interpret the culture. I think that's a huge challenge. It's changing so fast and it's
Yeah.
so divided and it flips on a dime and social media is so the algorithms it's really really complicated and if we don't understand if our wonderful young leaders don't learn how to interpret culture, then we can't communicate because if we don't understand the culture, we can't say things in a way they understand it, and if we can't
Yeah.
say it in the way they understand it, they don't know what we're saying, and leadership breaks down. So yeah, you got me all excited here. So I need to
No,
stop. But
no, no, please keep going if you want. Because this is where
no, no,
part of it,
no.
Dan, is even just thinking about, you just mentioned here about the new generation as well. That I think about the term that leaders have to be agile, right? They have to be able to approach things in a way where it's not just set in stone and that's it. And I was curious about this as a follow-up question, Dan. How do churches that are healthy when it comes to leadership development, how are they listening to the younger generation while still honoring the other generation beforehand? Because you start thinking about it, even like the home church, the church that we had in Atlanta, we celebrated 126 years last year. But we all realized that all started from a cornerstone of a family that was willing to be intentional and focus on the future in terms of future generations, while still being a mission for the generations that were there to help, right? And that's that whole thing. I was just curious in this part, Dan, how do church leaders focus on listening to the younger generation, right? Still approaching them while still honoring the other generations before them that are still a part of the congregation as well today?
I think I'm going to get a little bit repetitive and say I think it's based on the culture
Yeah.
because I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can honor who's come on before us with gratitude and honor and without sort of caving into getting stuck. I think that's well. Here's what I've observed in succession. So if the former generation is willing to empower and hand the baton, the next generation's willing to honor. If us boomers won't hand the baton, they have more trouble honoring because now they feel like they have to take the baton
Mm,
rather than they're handed it. But when they sense that we believe in them so much, we're going to hand it to them, they're really like us hanging around because there's a trust. There's a,
yeah.
you know, and so I think that's how it happens. And so who is it, a chicken or an egg? Who has to go first? I don't know. You might say, well, the older generation has to be willing to hand the baton. They can't,
Yeah.
be defensive, da 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 da. You might say, well, no, they have to honor first. I don't know which it is, but I think it comes back to mutual voluntary submission.
Mm,
And I feel so blessed at 12 Stone, we finished the succession process, all, triple succession. And they ask me back to teach the staff and coach the staff and be part of the staff. And I think that's that really healthy um, honoring and listening.
yeah.
And also we keep it light. We one of our many meetings a long time ago, Kevin and I would say, hey, you guys, Jason and Dan, when you guys are like, when you're ready for us to just not be around at all, just get us a couple of red jet skis and we are out of here. We are out of here. And of course, they flip it back on us on a dime and say, well, by the way, thank you for bringing that up because we wanted to tell you if you ever see two red jet skis in the parking lot, we're done with you. But you know what? That was a fun little moment that was spontaneous, but we actually continued that for a couple of years on
Yeah.
purpose to keep it light,
Yeah.
to keep something that can be a disaster in many churches, to keep it light. And it was the red jet ski joke. And I say joke because neither one of us want a jet ski. And but just you can almost perhaps feel the relationship I'm describing,
Yeah.
and that's so often not there.
Well, I think you pretty much knocked out another tenet that we were thinking about when it came to leadership is that it's not about control, like one person has the other. It's all about transfer, right? It's talking about even empowerment over micromanagement, even the consideration of releasing responsibility early. It's kind of hard, especially for folks that might be a little bit more type A, like myself, or even on the disc profile. I'm a mix of what you say I, so I'm very personal, but also D, so I'm very driven. And there are times I'm like, oh, it'd be so much easier for me just to handle it myself versus teach someone else. But then I realize, how is that actually going to help benefit the next person if I don't teach them or at least allow them to be empowered? And that's where even I think, Dan, you just started mentioning and even talking about that share, the transfer, and still honoring what has been there. In terms of that, do you feel like empowering those, especially young leaders on certain areas, do you think that's important over micromanagement? Because I know us at I don't really care for micromanagers. I prefer those that have that right balance. But I was just curious what your thoughts are. Like, how do you think you should approach that in terms of empowerment versus being very close, like holding their hands from a leadership side?
Yeah, I think well, again, if you're giving me permission to give my
Oh,
bias,
absolutely.
I think we absolutely cannot micromanage and hold their hands. We just cannot. It's like when I remember teaching my kids how to drive, and I took them both behind coals, and I thought they were trying to
Yeah.
kill me. I mean, but at the end of the day, if I won't hand, and we do this in the church all the time, if I won't hand them the keys to the car, they can't go anywhere. And so oftentimes, as a mom or a dad, we want to hand them the keys and then go, no, I can't. Well, I need the key. No, no. And you put that, well, here's the, yeah. And you go, I know you're going to wreck the car. Well, you might, but someone handed me the keys and I
Yep.
probably wrecked it many times, but so we have so often in the church, I think we just aren't willing to give them the keys.
Mm.
And we forgot somebody gave us the keys. And because leadership, authority, well, there's leaders, there's organizational authority, there's personal influence and innate power. But on the organizational um, uh, authority part, authority is biblically authority from the God, the Father to the Son, Jesus to the disciples. Authority is always transferred.
Yeah.
And sometimes where we get messed up is when we forgot, we start to believe it's ours and it wasn't handed to us. But the handing off, the transference, the baton, it's so important in empowerment. I actually think there's 5 components to it, and we know we don't have an hour to do a talk on this, but can I give you the 5?
Oh, please do.
Yeah,
Please do.
because they're really, really very straightforward. And I love using the illustration of the keys and kids driving and stuff. But number 1 is to trust with responsibility. That's where it starts. You've got to trust the person. Can you probably drive the car better than they? Can you probably do it better? Yeah, probably. Although sometimes it turns out they do it better than you later. But so it's trust with responsibility. Second is to train them for competence.
Mm.
You would never give your 16-year-old the car keys if you didn't have them in driver's ed, right? So
Absolutely.
trust with responsibility, train them for competence. Third is release them with authority. I mean, I see this in the church a lot. We give them a job, we give them the keys, but like in driving, if you don't give them insurance in the car or a budget, put gas in the car. I mean, they're still not going anywhere. And so we can hire them and give them the keys and a title, that's how we do it. But if we say, well, the budget, check with me. Decisions, check with me. Then we haven't done the third one, which is release them with authority.
Mm.
Then the fourth is to communicate clear expectations. When I taught my kids to drive, one of the rules they had is they had to be at home with the car by midnight. I thought that was generous. I think they thought that was lame, but whatever. But they had to be home by midnight. And if you weren't home, you lose privileges. You lose the car. You can't have the keys. So that's an important question here. When we have longer, deeper conversations on empowerment, one of the questions that always comes up is, do you ever need to, or should you ever unempower somebody? And I think the answer is yes, but that should be extremely rare. It should be, if you've done everything right, unempowering should be extremely rare, and it's based on somebody breaking the commitment to the expectations. You got home at 1 a.m. You knew what was going to happen. That's not there's a difference between a leader who made a mistake. Of course, you're going to make mistakes. Make mistakes.
Sure.
Mistakes. Just don't do the same mistake twice, because that means you're not learning.
Yeah.
Of course, you're going to make mistakes. That's different than you knew what time it was and you did it anyway. And so there are those rare moments when you unempower, but they should be rare. And then the last one, number 5, is to love and believe in them for their maximum potential. That goes back to where we started. But I think that's a super practical steps that this you might laugh at this, but I love asking the pastors I coach, so tell me how you empower. And almost always they'll go, well, Dan, I empower them. And I know you do. You're wonderful. You're charismatic. You're visionary, and you got a lot. But just tell me how you empower. Well, and then they get a little frustrated. I empower. Yeah, I empower. And I go, okay, you don't know how you do it, do you? No, I really don't know how. And so I walk them through in much more detail those 5 points, and they go, wow, okay. But here's the good news: it's not 27 points, and they're not really complicated.
Sure.
It's just, do we actually have the ability within us to actually do it?
And I'm sure for a lot of those pastors, I mean, they're I'm sure they're all really great pastors, but it's
Oh
probably
yeah.
really hard for them to let go and really trust that this is going to happen when they hand the keys over, right? Because there's a part of it is like to an extent, from a leadership side, you to an extent own a lot of the things that happen. Not saying you figuratively own the properties, but since it's some of the stuff that you've really fostered and invested, it's sometimes hard to let go. And that's where part of it is this leadership side. It teaches both the young leader and also the leader there about handing it off and responsibility, accountability, right? Being consistent with follow through, but then trusting, right? God has a plan in this case, and I'm going to entrust that you have a great potential, and this is how my way of showing it too. That's one of the things I've also gained from these couple of items that you shared too, Dan.
Yeah, I think too, when I started at Tulsa in 2001 with Kevin, um, he was the founding pastor. And it's sometimes more difficult for a it's their baby. They poured
Oh
they
yeah,
they carved it out of nothing, and they did Kevin did the hard work. And 7 years, this first 7 years were very, very challenging. And when I came in the 14th year of the church, they were teasingly, in a very affectionate way, saying, he's never going to give the keys to Reiland. And if he does, he's going to take them back. Oh, he gave me the keys and he never took them back. And as a matter of fact, years later, I tried to give them back and he said, nope, they're
you're
yours
holding on to
now.
those.
But we would laugh, but he didn't. There's a couple of departments that said, well, what, we're getting bigger now. Why don't you take these guys? I'll take these guys. He said, nope. And so and John was the same way. They never took the keys back, never once. And are John and Kevin faster, smarter, better leader? Yep. But they trusted me and they said, you can do it and you lead it, you lead the teams, I'll lead the big, you lead the teams. And it was those things, that kind of trust and having each other's back is just essential to this process.
Well, I know, like you talk about having to trust, and this is where part of it is. I'm sure all these pastors that come to you and say, "Dan, I'd love to learn from you," and of course, you share those 5 core tenets. But as a part of that conversation, you just mentioned about the trust piece is pretty much a non-negotiable. What are some additional non-negotiables that you coach leaders on when they come to you and say, "Hey, Dan, I would love to get coached by you on a leadership development side"?
Wow, of course, it's all custom, so we
Yeah,
go
yeah,
where
yeah,
they are. And some of the guys are more on, strategy and X's and O's, and some of them are more are like, my church is awesome, I'm a mess, and so we kind of go where they need to go. But among some of the top things that are more common, I think as we get acquainted, you see, I kind of start at the heart.
oh yeah,
So the everybody starts at self-awareness, whether they're a resident just out of 22 years old or a 42-year-old successful senior pastor. All leadership development starts with self-awareness. And then on the spiritual side, you mentioned earlier, Ken, humility. A surprising one that surprises most of the guys is we definitely talk about prayer a
mm,
lot, because that's the power. That's kind of everything. And I love kind of introducing and exploring their world in terms of think time.
yeah,
I love asking, when do you think? I think all the time. No, you don't. And where is it in your calendar and what do you do with it? And then I think, again, on all these internal things, healthy rhythms, pressure, how you handle pressure. Um, then I think it moves to like the next level. And these are all integrated. This isn't a linear thing.
yeah,
I think it moves to things like it's all about people. And of course, your ability to connect with people, that kind of thing. It's always vision focused, keep the big picture in mind. And then the last area is where I think a lot of leadership starts, but uh, all the things I just mentioned are more my foundational approach. It ends then in all the skills we talk about all the time, communication skills, recruiting skills,
yeah,
development skills, all the skills we know. We just have to develop another one you mentioned earlier is the capacity of those skills.
yeah,
I think if you start with skills, it's almost like a gifted musician. They're so good and they're so gifted, you just go to that skill-based thing and turn them loose. But if you don't tend to those underneath foundational things with character and all that stuff we
yeah.
just talked about, we lose some of the most gifted, beautiful, wonderful musicians because we didn't help them with the foundation.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm curious about this too as well, Dan, because I know even you start about leadership development, it keeps going. And this were some of the things you talked about, whether it's humility, even when it's talking about just responsibility, trust, and all. Is there, and this doesn't have to be a right or wrong question. I'm curious about this because even some of the things when we talked about from culture, when we talked about succession, and all, when we talk about things, there's a pace to it, and there's also the concept of rest. And this is where part is. I'm curious is can rest be a part of leadership development too? Because as as a pastor or a leader, you're going, right? You're trying to get better. You're trying to do things. But you start thinking about, is it also important, whether it's sabbaticals or something like that, for leaders to consider as a part of development to also find ways to provide that type of breathing room, and whether it's sabbaticals or breaks as a part of leadership development? I was just curious about that for you, Dan. That was something that was in the back of my mind for a while as well.
Yeah, uh, unquestionably. And everybody's different. I try not to do a cookie cutter mold. You know, there
Yeah.
are some guys
Yeah.
that they go on vacation. I put my cell phone in a drawer for 2 weeks and I never look at it. Well, okay,
Yeah.
yay, but I don't think guilt and boxes help people. Then the other guys, he looks at his cell phone every 2 minutes. I think there's a space in the middle that's custom for whoever you are and whatever
Right.
your circumstances are and your nature. Some people have more energy and a bigger battery. Everybody's different, so you've got to coach them in a different way. But the fundamentals are you're right. Where are the margins in your life?
Yeah.
Where are the rhythms based? And because there's daily rhythms, there's weekly rhythms, there's annual rhythms. Um, Let me give you a simple little metaphor that I like, and it's helpful, I
Yeah.
think. For musicians, I'm a pretend wannabe guitar player. I have a wonderful collection. My collection is 10 times better than my abilities. But in music, you heard of a metronome, of course,
I do. Yes.
and and it's faster and slower, and slower and wider. And I think the rhythms in life are kind of like a metronome, and a- a- and there's a rhythm to it. And so sometimes we go way out, like go way out here and it's Easter, like, whoa, it's all about Easter and there's no margins,
Yep.
and we go way over here and we launch another campus, or something. Then we go way over here. And as long as we come back to the center, we'll come back to that. The going way out isn't the problem. The
Yeah.
problem when your rhythms and the rhythm breaks down is when you go way out and you don't come back. So, for example, let's take one of the go way out examples like vacation. So you go way out here for 2 weeks. You lay on a beach. You forsake all responsibilities and eat whatever you want. Right? Well, how is that balanced? If somebody, I'd love to go on vacation for 6 months. No, you wouldn't. That's that's as bad as. So the problem is when we go, what I see with leaders, high capacity, high energy, great vision, godly people, is they have these they're so passionate, which is good,
Yeah.
but they go out and they don't come back.
Mm.
So and those bigger annual things and the weeklies and the dailies. So here it is. What's your spiritual center? What's that daily thing in your life that you've got to come back to that allows sanity to be in these wide swings? For me, not for everybody, but for me, it's exercise and prayer.
Mm.
If I have that every single day, do I mess up and blow up something? Yeah, but I'm pretty darn consistent. But for me, that glues it all together. Different guys, different women, different, that's a different thing, their center. But what is it that keeps your rhythm um, whole and healthy? Like, do you
Yeah.
have that center for you, Ken? What
Absolutely.
picture would that look like for you?
Yeah, and this is where you start thinking about what my center is, right? It courses around two things: God and family. And this is where a lot of it ends up being the case that I can hear very quickly from my family if I'm traveling too much or
Perfect.
focus too much, and right. And to talk about is being present, because there's a lot of times that I think if you start thinking about, I'm a pastor's kid too as well, Dan. So that's where you see like my dad was very big on being kingdom building. He helped, with his church. They planted, I think, 20 to 25 churches in that greater New York area. But he always gives God the credit for that. But that's where part of it is like he was very driven, but he also found time to go back to what was most important to him, which was family and God. And that's one
Good.
of the things that I've had as the tenets of my side was saying, okay, I am far from perfect, especially when it comes to this. I will stumble in terms of being able to find the right margins, but trying to always get back to that, right? We try to make this emphasis of saying we want to be present, we want to be intentional with our family. We had an episode that talked about work-life balance, and I got this from another mentor of mine. He was a pastor of a large church in Texas, and he essentially said, "Hey, Ken, you look at the outlets, right? You especially see the one in the bathroom. There's one that has that term that says GFCI, right? And that in itself represents your priorities for where you need to focus. First one is God, right? That's my main focus, first and foremost. The F under GF is for family, right? Family and friends. That's where you want to have the next one. C is actually for career, right? Saying like, hey, that is still important. It provides for God, for family and all, but that in itself, between all of it, that takes the most priority is your family and God. And then I is anything else that interests you, right? So that's what I've always tried to do as a part of this. And this is where even, I've talked about this, Dan, is my mentors will tell me like, Ken, slow down. It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? And that helps resets like, okay, I need to make sure I have the ability to say no. Because anytime I say yes to something, I know I'm saying no to something else that I don't realize. And so it's talking about that pendulum, right? There have been times in my younger years, Dan, when I wasn't married yet, that whole thing about just focusing on just, career, travel, all that, that was kind of the forefront. Now I've been able to really reset it and saying, like, these are the core tenets for me. The Lord allows me to be able to continue being here at Cape and Krause, but at the end of the day, these are some of the things that I always want to hold true, which is two roles that I have that I don't ever want to be replaced, which is father to my kids and husband to my wife. And those
So
are
good.
some of the things there that essentially helps me allow that, right? Still, it's a work in progress, right, Dan? As you can tell, right? It is
It
never
is.
something that gets done overnight, but over the years, my goal has to always stay focused on that too.
It is. And because, you know, part of it too is sometimes we'll say we're working too much,
Yeah.
but when we get to have the deeper, honest conversations, I'll usually talk about, well, yeah, I have for sure,
Yeah.
but there's also a point of calling in here. And so it's not just there's a fine line about, and not an excuse, but it's a calling. And so that sounds, I love, how you word yours, that God and family. And interestingly enough, that's one that comes up commonly. And they'll say, well, Dan, how come you don't say family? And I said, well, here's what I've learned for me. If I'm on prayer and I'm on exercise, my family life is really good.
Mm.
When I'm missing that, I'm not so good
Yeah.
because then I'm out of whack again,
It's out of whack. Yeah.
and I think it's okay to go way out here, like on vacation, right?
Yeah.
And go way over here and you're writing a book and way over here. But man, you got to come back here. That's what keeps it all. And having, like you mentioned, people to speak into your life, the mentors that speak into my life, and the mentors and coaches. And um, I just think it's really difficult. It's almost scary. I've got six thoughts in my mind at one time, but it's very scary thing to be a isolated leader. You've got to have voices that speak into your life. Your inner
Absolutely.
circle. We talk about who are in your inner
Yeah.
circle. I've had prayer partners for 29 years now,
Wow.
and I would never do ministry without, one couple it's been 27 years or maybe more. So, interesting thing here. We both have championed prayer. So let me maybe give a little anecdote that's helpful. When I was at Skyline, I had 30 prayer partners, and that was one for every day of the month, obviously.
Yeah.
And back in those days, we actually had letters that actually went in the mail in the 80s, and they would have things to pray for, and that was awesome. But that
Yeah.
that crew of 30 that ebbs and flowed was more of like the old term fishing pools. Let's see, the cream rises to the top. Let's see who's there in this spiritual environment of prayer. And so when I came to 12 Stone, I thought, well, I need to do the same thing. And so I thought, well, I'll get 30 prayer partners, and God stopped me. He said, I don't want you to have 30. I kind of paused, and it wasn't an audible voice, but very clear.
Yeah.
It's very
You
clear.
could feel it. Yep.
And he said, I want you to have 7. And I'm listening. And he said, I want you to have 7 because I want you to pray as much for them as they pray for you. It's going to be more intimate.
Yeah.
And, um, and so I've done 7 ever since. And it's been unbelievable. 'Cause I'm kind of a team guy and I love
Yeah.
have the meeting with the 30. And I tried the first few years to pull the 7 together. Never worked. I'm pretty good with teams. Never worked because they weren't a team.
Yeah.
They were God connects. There were 7 different God connects that he orchestrated. It was his team. He didn't need meetings,
Yeah.
and it was awesome. And it still is.
And I think that's great, especially, as we started about landing the plane here, the encouragement of especially telling church pastors and leaders, don't do this alone, right? That's been some of the tenets of what we've talked about for our themes for Margin for Mission has been a lot of times pastors and all, you could feel isolated very quickly in all these different areas. And this is where the encouragement is coming, even from fellow pastors, of saying, look, you need to find a circle around you. You need to find folks that are willing to pray for you, encourage you, hold you accountable, but do this with you so that you're not going out alone. I'm curious, Dan, as we start to close down, what are some encouragement that you can give for church leaders as a part of this, whether it's church leadership or those that are just feeling stuck right now?
Yeah, I think that couple things. Um, I'll go strategic first and then maybe
Sure.
talk. So I'm sort of changing my thoughts here because of the conversation.
Sure.
Strategic, I would say, if you're feeling stuck or overwhelmed or kind of in a difficult spot, most churches, most leaders are one tough call, one critical decision away from a breakthrough.
Mm.
And most of the time, you know the decision that needs to be made. You just need the encouragement, someone that believes in you, someone to talk to make the decision you probably already know that probably could unleash your church to the next. Maybe we talk about leaps and layers. Sometimes
Mhm.
churches grow in leaps and sometimes they grow in layers. But one critical decision, one tough call, you're typically, one away from a breakthrough. And on the heart side, I would say, who do you have to talk to? Who do you have that you trust them, they love you, they care about you, you respect their
Mm.
thinking, maybe they've traveled a little bit farther than you. Who do you have to talk to about that tough call? And see if you could just have these conversations and see how they could maybe speak into your life to bolster the courage to go ahead and do what needs to be done, and then watch what God will do.
That's amazing. I love it, Dan. And this is where part of it is those are things that are practical, but sometimes it's hard for us to remember those things. And just having that reminder is going to be so important for our church leaders. Well, Dan, I love this. I know it's one of those things where just being able to have this conversation with you and the amount of history and experience you've had serving not just at Enjoy, but also at 12 Stone, other ministries, you are making a huge impact across the country with church leaders you get to interact with. So I am so grateful that you were on this podcast with me today. And thank you
Ted,
again, Dan. I appreciate you being on this episode and look forward to our next one too.
good, me too.
This is not a CPA firm. Assurance, attest, and audit services provided by Cape & Krause, LLC. Carr, Riggs & Ingram, and CRI are the brand names under which Carr, Riggs & Ingram, LLC, CRI Advisors, LLC, and Cape & Krause, LLC, and CRI Cape & Krause Advisors, LLC provide professional services. CRI CPA, Cape & Krause CPA, CRI Advisors, Cape & Krause Advisors, Carr, Riggs & Ingram Capital, LLC, and their respective subsidiaries operate as an alternative practice structure in accordance with the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct and applicable law, regulations, and professional standards. CRI CPA and Cape & Krause CPA are licensed independent certified public accounting firms that separately provide attest services, as well as additional ancillary services to their clients. CRI CPA and Cape & Krause CPA are independently owned CPA firms that provide attestation services separate from one another. CRI Advisors and Cape & Krause Advisors provide tax and business consulting services to its clients. CRI Advisors and its subsidiaries, including Cape & Krause Advisors, are not licensed CPA firms and will not provide any attest services. The entities falling under the Carr, Riggs & Ingram, or CRI brand are independently owned and are not responsible or liable for the services and or products provided, or engaged to be provided by any other entity under the Carr, Riggs & Ingram, or CRI brand. Our use of the term CRI, we, are, us, and terms of similar import, denote the alternative practice structure conducted by CRI CPA, Cape and Krause CPA, Cape and Krause Advisors, and CRI Advisors as appropriate.